Here we go. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvi'is, Perek Dalit, Halacha Aleph, and Halacha Beis. We're learning today Daf Chav Vav. We left off on Daf Chav Vav Amid Aleph, 4 lines from the top of the Amid by the Gemara, by the beginning of the Gemara. Let's quickly review the din that we had in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said that Bari Shaina, initially, if a person wanted to clear Eitzim, and the Mishnah in our Girsa has Avanim and Asavim, same idea that we had by stones in the previous chapter. We begin now with the pieces of wood and or with grass, that if the intent is to clear out the field to prepare it for planting, that is Asan Midrabana. Even when the intention is not to clear the field, you need the wood for fire, you need the grass for animal food, or you simply want to clear out your yard, it should be neat, but not for planting. Then there is no Isur the Rabbanon, but you have to address a Maras Ayin issue. And how did they address the Maras Ayin when it came to Eitzim and Asavim? So the Mishnah said that just like I am allowed to clear everything from someone else's field, because there's no Maras Ayin, I'm not clearing your field for you to be able to plant it. I'm clearing it because I want the items for myself if I'm allowed to take it. Even when I'm clearing it from my field, the Mishnah said that at Barishaina, I was allowed to take Hagas. That means I was allowed to take the large pieces, and I left the smaller pieces. As long as I left the smaller pieces on the field, it's clear I'm not preparing my field for planting because I'm leaving things over there. That was Barishaina. But since people, they were dishonest, and they did that which you were not allowed to do, they claimed that they were only doing that which they were allowed to do. So Chachamim became a lot more stringent. That was what the Mishnah said, Misharabu Ovrei Avera. And what they said is, I am not allowed to clear anything from my field, period. I am allowed to clear from your field. You are allowed to clear from my field. But the only way I am allowed to clear from someone else's field is 2 things. Number 1, no prearrangement. In other words, if you asked me to do it for you, I'm not allowed to do it. And even after I did it, no thank you. No pre, no post. That which on Shvi'is is, so to say, hefker-like, and I am allowed to take, fine. I can go to your field and take. I need to have some firewood. I go to my neighbor's field and I clear out wood. Now, when I clear out from someone else's field, I don't have to only clear out the big ones to leave the small ones. I can take them all out. That's the way we learned the Mishnah.
And there's no Marat Ain because the locals know who's doing it for whom, right?
Yeah, well, the locals know it's not my field.
Right.
That's what we already had, and we already had this in the daf.
Right.
Okay, now like this. First of all, there's going to be a version in the Gemara which will be fascinating, that not only, like the Mishnah says, was there Barishaina, there was initially, then Misharabu Ovrei Aveda, they made more restrictions. There was yet a third. Because don't forget, I mean, there's no limit to if when people want to be disingenuous. We're not speaking about people that don't care. Like, if people don't care, they're going to just blatantly violate the laws. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people that want to appear like they're observant, but they figured out a way how to do it in a way that they can claim everything was kosher. There was a third stage, according to one approach in the Gemara, where people, I did it for you, you did it for me. We did make a prearrangement. We made deals. And therefore, they made it even more stringent. But the Gemara is going to say that we're going to reject that indeed happened because Rabbeinu HaKadosh did not put it in the Mishnah. That will be interesting. Now, a lot of the Gemara, until the next halacha beis, will be not halacha l'maisa, but it will be of what was the din in the Barishaina phase. Like we said, you have to take the big, you can take the big in the Barishaina, and you have to leave the small. What happens if you have large, medium, and small? So when you took the large, you left the medium and small. But now you have medium and small. Can you take the medium? What would happen if you only have one size? You don't have big and small. It's all the same size. Can you take some and leave some? These will be the types of inquiries the Gemara is going to have. Again, even though it's not going to be relevant halachically, because already Bisman HaGemara, right, the Rebbe already wrote Misharabu Ovrei Avedo Hiskino. Nevertheless, that's normal for the Gemara to go back and to discuss how things used to be. We're going to have on Chavav Amid Beis, we're going to move on to the next Mishnah, to Halacha Beis. The next Mishnah now will speak, firstly, about the penalties that Chazal sometimes imposed on Shvi'is violators. And we'll see what will be the sometimes yeah and sometimes not. If the prohibition that was violated will be classified as a significant act, which means an act that completely prepares the field for planting, we will see then there's going to be a penalty for one not to derive benefit from that activity even after Shvi'is, if the violator did something that halachically is not classified as a significant act. In other words, he did something that doesn't fully prepare the field for planting, as we'll speak out when we learn the Mishnah. On Chavav Amid Beis, there, even though the person violated the Rabbanan, there was no penalty imposed. That will be the first topic of the Mishnah. And the second and the final topic of the Mishnah will be, what is the status of produce that grew on Shvi'is because of the Shvi'is being violated? So the first part speaks about penalties of you using the field in the 8th year. Second part of the Mishnah is going to speak about the peitus itself that grew on Shvi'is, be'isur. We're not talking about svichim that we already mentioned before. That means if something grew on its own, midrabanan, you're not allowed to eat it. I'm talking about something that grew as a result of work that was done. Again, we're going to see that topic in the Mishnah as well. And Chavre, let's go back to Daf Chavav Amud Aleph. All right, beginning with the Gemara, 4 lines from the top of the Amud. Okay. So when the Mishnah says, "Barishoyna hoyo oimrim," Amar Rabbi Yoina, says Rabbi Yoina. Now you have to go. If you see the words of the Mishnah, it's not clear enough, because what the Mishnah said was that we have it on Chafei Amid Beis that Melakid Adam Eitzim va'avanim va'asavim. Our girsa is wood and stones and grasses. Mitoich shaloi, from his field. Kiderech shehu melakid mitoich shel chaveda, just like he can take it from someone else's field. Now, Barishoyna, someone else's field, there also do I have the restriction of es hagas, or from my fellow's field I can take gas, thick ones, big ones, and little ones, everything. And Barishoyna, they allowed me to take from my field only the big ones, the way I am allowed to take all from my fellow's field. The latter is the right interpretation. That's what Rabbi Yoina clarifies. Amar Rabbi Yoina, hachin tzarchei misna. This is the way you have to learn the Mishnah. But Melakid Adam Eitzim, and you see clearly in our Gemara, Rabbi Yoina did not have the words Avanim in the Mishnah proper, and that would fit because Avanim was the second topic of the previous chapter. The new chapter is speaking about new items, Eitzim and Asavim, right? Sticks, wood, lumber, and grasses. So a person is allowed to gather Eitzim, Asavim, Mitoich Shaloi Agas. He can take from his own only the large ones. Same way he's allowed to take from his fellow's field, Bein Dakim Vigasim, whether big or small, like we mentioned. In other words, from my fellow's field, Kavan, there will never be Marasayim. There will never be Marasayim because people don't clear out their fellow's field if they don't need the item that they are taking simply for their fellow to be able to plant it on the 8th year. People don't do that. So from my fellow, I can take everything. But Ishoina, I'm allowed to take from my field the large pieces. Aber what happened? But what happened was people began to take even the smaller ones from their field. And they were claiming, no, I did it beheter. What I did it in the way bo'ifan hamuter. And the owners claimed, Bigasim likatnu, I only took the large ones. Ironically, there was nothing left. But we're going to see in the Gemara later about that. So what did the Chachamim do? That's what Rabbi writes in the Mishnah. Hiskinu. So they made a new takana, that I am not even allowed to take large pieces of wood or large grasses from my own field. The only thing I'm allowed to do is to take from my fellow's field, which is reading the words, that one can take only from the other. Reuven can take from Shimon. Shimon can only be malaket mitoich shozeh from Reuven. And on that, shaloi b'toiva. And shaloi b'toiva means, guys, two things. Number one, no prearrangement. In other words, even if I don't plan to pay you, but if I ask you, tumachatoiva, you're not allowed to do that. And shaloi b'toiva means, the way we learned in the Mara Fulda, that even if I did it without a prearrangement, after I did it, you cannot tell me thank you, which would give the appearance that you wanted me to do it for your field to be cleared for the next year's planting. Okay. So that is what Rabbi Yoina first clarifies, which is the way we learned the Mishnah. Now here Rabbi Yoina has something that we never learned. Rabbi Yoina says that it didn't end over there. Rabbi Yoina is not talking about something that happened later in the times of the Gemara. Rabbi Yoina is referring to something that he had in a Braisa or in a Tosefta that still happened in the times of the Tanoim. That even after they made this new takana, only one from the other shaloi b'toiva, still nechshadu li yois malakten b'toiva. That people, they abused this permit, this heter, and they asked one the other, or they thanked one the other, and they still claimed shaloi b'toiva likatnu, shaloi but not pre, not post. So there was another step of this takana. So what happened over then? Hiskinu, they made a new takana. And what was that new takana? Literally, it means that people can only collect from that which is closed. And that which is available, what does that mean? Let's go with the Mara Fulda, 8-9 lines from the top, that says that Chachamim says you are only allowed to take wood or grass from fields that are hefker, or from the public domain. That's what he writes. That they said you can't take it from anyone's field. That's the meaning of karev and matzoi. Interesting expression. I understand how matzoi means hefker. Why does karev mean hefker the way I understand it? Because if it's not going to be near my field, other people will take it before I got there. Hefker, it's ownerless. So you have to go out like to the public areas and take whatever you find.
All right, what percentage of people were not keeping the halacha to have the Rabbanim do this?
It must be a substantial amount of people, Kevin. And let's not make a mistake over here, just not to overly criticize them, even though they did not do. I mean, they're called Oivdei Aveda,
right.
But they were not. When it comes to Maras Ayin, I understand the psychology. People say that I'm not doing. I am doing it. It's okay. I'm not doing anything bad. I'm just not doing it in a way where there's maras ayin. But because you look at me and with bad eyes, I have to modify my behavior.
Right. And Rabbi, didn't we have this thing here where people were using on Shabbat scooters and the rabbi says you can use them?
That's something else. Let me tell you what that is. That's a whole different topic. There's something called uvda altera. Uvda dechoil. Uvda dechoil means mundane activity. It's very difficult to define uvda dechoil. It's very difficult to define it. Don't forget, scooters and stuff like that did not. Whenever Chazal defined something, I'm a chaya. How they defined it, we adhere to it, even if the whole world changed over. I don't care. But when it comes to applying a Talmudic concept into a modern new reality, so there was a time that everyone said it was uvda dechoil. I am not saying that it's not. All I'm saying is that the type of opposition I did not see happen anymore. I don't see happen because everyone is using it.
Right.
But here it's a little bit different. Here we're speaking about Marasayim. Okay. Right. So says Rab Ze'eda, when he heard what Rabbi Yoina said, he rejected what Rabbi Yoina said. Guys, again, if Rabbi Yoina would have shared something that happened in his era, he was an Amoira, we would not reject it. What Rabbi Yoina is saying is that even in the times of the Mishnah, it wasn't only how it used to be. And then there was one time where the Chachamim added more restrictions. They again added restrictions. If that would have been true, Rebbe would have written it. And by the fact that Rebbe did not write it in the Mishnah, that means that his source is not authoritative. Amar Rab Ze'eda, Rishoina miskayemes. Rishoina means only the first one and the second one. There was no third one. It's not authoritative. So it teaches the Maraful. He writes it's a Tosefta. The fact that the Mishnah did not write it means that Rabbeinu HaKadosh rejected that there was such a thing. Now, it could be there was such a thing, but it wasn't accepted. It was only a very small minority group. They're not having a machlekes and mitzias, but we only keep to the first two. Okay. Now, even though the Mishnah already wrote that the Barishoina no longer stands, almost everything that the Gemara will discuss now until the new Mishnah will be about what is the halacha in the original times, which is also interesting. You can say lamay nafkamina, but there's a nafkamina. It must be. We have to know how it was. When do we say that Barishoina I was only allowed to take my gas, my large ones, because of Marasai and Kevan? That's only if I don't have animals in my field. But if my animal is in the field, everyone sees I have an animal or animals, I am allowed to gather all of the grass in my own field. Why? Because everyone sees that I have animals to feed. No one will think that I am gathering the grass to clear my field for planting when they see what I need it for. And similarly, if a person had an oven in the sada, people had kiros in their chatzerim. We're not speaking about a chatzar, we're speaking about a sada. But if that was so, it's unusual. But if someone had over there an oven, and you're gathering wood, again, even you are allowed to gather all of the wood, not only the big pieces. People, it's evident that you are gathering it because you need to have fuel, and not because you want to clear your field. Now, the inquiry, the Gemara wants to know what happens if you had, like I said, large, medium, and small. You had 3 sizes of wood. And when you gathered, you can only gather the large ones, which is the largest. When you gathered the largest, when you left the medium and the small, the medium was classified as little. The medium then needed to be left. And now you use those firewoods. Are you allowed to gather now the medium size? Because relative to the small, the medium is now the big. Before, the medium was considered small. It was not the gas. It was not the largest. So do we allow for the status of the medium to change because it's all relative? Or do we say that once we classify the medium as not the gas, you no longer can take it at all? That's the Gemara's question. If you gathered it getting body shoina, now you can't do anything, nothing to talk about. But when you were allowed to gather from your own field, what happens if likat begasim? And when you had already 3 different sizes, can you now take the large ones of the small ones, which I call the medium? Are you allowed to do that? So for this, the Gemara answers. So what could you or could you not? So answers the Gemara, Im Amar At Kain, if you would be allowed now to take what the Gemara calls the Gasim Shebedakim, the medium size, or the larger from the small ones, the potential of abuse would be so big that everyone would end up gathering. Because every time you would want to gather, you would gather more. And you would say, I left the small ones. And then you would gather the small ones because there's another even smaller one. And then the smallest one got blown away in the wind. However a person would say it. So the Gemara says, no, they did not allow you to do that. Once you made one gathering, and whatever you were not allowed to leave the first time because it wasn't hagas, becomes defined as small, and that has to be left. And now the Gemara says, okay, well, now what were to happen if you never had different sizes? What happens if you only had one size from the outset? What's the 2 options? The 2 options is you can't pick anything, you can't take anything, or you can take some. Because what's the maras ayin? I'm clearing out my field. As long as I leave some, people see I'm not clearing out my field. So would I be allowed to pick some or not? Now, I didn't even know how much would the sum be, but that's the kash. That's the question. And here the Gemara says, instead of giving an answer, the Gemara points out that from 2 different Mishnayos, from each one, we infer the opposite ruling. Tarten masnayon. I'm going to quote to you 2 Mishnayos, Chada Amra or Hada Amra. From one of them, we will imply that it will be allowed. And V'chada Amra, and from the other one, will imply that it will be Asur, which is really a contradiction. And the Bavli, we spend a lot of time with the contradiction here. We're not even going to attempt to respond to the contradiction. We're just going to point out that we can infer the answer from two different Mishnayos, from each one in the different direction. Mishnah number 1, my friends, we already learned a few daf ago. So Mishnah, the first proof that we are quoting to resolve this inquiry comes from the previous chapter, Perek Gimel Halacha Hey, in our pagination from Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis. The Mishnah there was speaking about if a person had prior to Shvi'is a lot of loose stones on their field and they want to take some of them off. So the Mishnah says, right, there are exceptions, but the rule is that as long as you leave the ones touching the ground on the ground, the elyonos can be removed. That hamasakel sodeum, if you want to clear your field from stones on Shvi'is, noitelas elyonos, you are allowed to remove all of the upper ones. However, umaniach es hanoigos ba'aretz, as long as you leave the ones touching the ground on the ground. Now, what is the inference from that Mishnah? We are presuming, and that makes sense, that the hamasakel sodeu, the Mishnah that we just quoted, is referring to stones that are all of the same size. And yet the Mishnah allows you to take some. In that case, by leaving the ones that are touching the ground. So the same thing over here. If you have eitzim, or if you have asavim, and they are all of the same size, same idea. You can't pick them all, but as long as you leave some, you'll be good. But Rishonim, you were only allowed to take hagasim. Yeah, that's if you have big and small, then the Chazal said take the big ones. Makes more sense. Because the big ones, if you need fuel, take the bigger ones. They're going to give you more fuel. You need animal fodder, take the bigger grasses. So Hada Amra, that Shari, and look inside the Pnei Moshe, second line. Hadam Roshari Koloimer, the Mahai Mas Nisan, from this Mishnah Shema'inon, we infer the Hakol Moedim, everyone will agree. Shemuter Lalaket Kol Ol Yoinos. You can take all of the pebbles above. Ubavachi Aniach Hasanoiges Ba'aretz. Ubahachi Sagi Shenikar Shein Meschav Nasakan Asada. So likewise, same thing will be over here. So that Mishnah that we learned already, Luchu'ura, will tell us that you are allowed. However, the Gemara now was going to say that we're going to have a Mishnah, Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis, in this same chapter, Halacha Daled. The Mishnah is going to speak about someone who has an olive grove, olive trees, and they want to thin out the area, as we learned a lot, also in the previous Perek, in the previous Masechta, that when trees are planted too close one to the other, they end up taking the nourishment away from the ground, and it's detrimental to all of the trees. So are you allowed to thin out a densely packed area from some of the trees? That's called hamedel. We had that word in the Masechtas, kalayim, I think, thinning out. So the Mishnah said like this, thinning out, you are allowed to do. But as long as it is evident that you're only thinning out and not clearing out an area. The moment you are clearing out an area, that already is prohibited. Because again, it looks like you are preparing a patch of land inside this olive orchard in order for you to plant. And don't forget, Chayzer, I'm quoting Kalayim, don't forget that when it comes to planting grains, veggies, legumes with trees, there's no problem. Remember that? Kalayim is only Zeroyim and Zeroyim. And then there's something unique about a vine. Unique, but other trees you can't graft, but you can plant. So Bekitza, you are allowed to thin out. You're not allowed to clear out. Now, in that itself, Beis Shammai says that that you are allowed to uproot trees, even when you're clearing out. Beis Hillel is the one that says that when you are clearing out a patch, it means he's machmer, you have to only raise them to the ground, but you cannot uproot them. Everyone holds in concept. Thinning is not a problem. The question will be when you're clearing. And the Mishnah says, now we're beginning to quote the Mishnah, Ezeu hamedel. How do you classify only thinning out? Where Beis Hillel will be lenient here, like Beis Shammai. When you're thinning out, not only can you raise it till the ground, but you can even uproot them. So Beis Hillel says, Achas o shtayim. If it's one or two trees, from nearby 3, 1 or 2 from a nearby 3, that's not called clearing out. However, if you're going to clear out 3 from 3, that's already not called thinning out, that's called clearing out a patch. Okay. Now, what's the raya over there that it's also? Of course, if you have 3 trees and 3 trees, it's like big stones and big stones. What does Beis Hillel say? What Beis Hillel says is that if you're going to remove 3 trees, it looks like you're clearing out an area and you can't uproot them. So here also, if you're taking out some stones amongst other stones when they have the same size, some eitzim amongst other eitzim when they have the same size, we won't be allowed to do it because it looks like you're clearing out an area. True, you're not clearing out the entire field for planting, but you're clearing out a patch of the field for planting. So Hada Amra Asur. So from that Mishnah, Daf Chavtes Amud Beis, we have an implication that you're not allowed to do it. Okay. The Gemara doesn't say it's a stira. The Gemara doesn't try to resolve it. The Gemara just points out that we can go on this way, you can go on that way.
Oh, wait, is this again for Maratain?
All for Marasayin, Keva.
So how does an observer from a distance see if you're clearing or taking out the roots? How does one see that?
That I'm sure you can see. You're talking about the in Daf Chavtes Amud Beis.
Right.
You can see that. Okay. As we had already a few times, we make a correlation between the laws of Shvi'is, the prohibitions of working, the agricultural work, and the laws of Chol HaMoed, which are a lot more extensive. Chol HaMoed, we begin with the premise that you may not do any work on Chol HaMoed unless you have one of the 5 Atadim. So now the Gemara says, I want to know, how will we relate the restrictions of our sugya to the dinim of Chol HaMoed? So asks the Gemara, this is a question, Af b'moyed kain? If a person has a field and they want to remove on Chol HaMoed from their field some sticks, some stones, some grasses, will they be allowed to remove the large ones as long as they leave the small ones? Will that be something permitted or not? And I want to say something. The whole kasha is only on the Borishoina time. Here again, because after the Chachamim revised the law on Shvi'is, and they said it's Asur, we always learned that Chol HaMoed is even more Chomer than Shvi'is. Then for sure it would be Asur. So the Gemara wants to know that Barishoina, were you allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed? That was the Gemara's kasha. Answers the Gemara, Ashkach Tanem, Tana Tane. That the Gemara, the Amirayim in the Yerushalmi, they found the Tana, and this was the Tana that they taught. That Melaked Adam Eitzim Va'asavim Metoich Shaloi, only as Agas. That this whole heter, and look at the way he words it, the way Rabbi Yoina began today's Gemara, that a person is allowed to remove from his field only the large ones, the way he is allowed to remove from his fellow's field, all of them. But all of that is only b'shvi'is. Avaloi b'moed. And Chol HaMoed, you were never allowed to do it. And why were you never allowed to do it? Just to remember, because we learned that even when there's a hefsid, we never are allowed to work on Chol HaMoed, something that's called tircha yisera, which is excessive exertion. That's something that may not be done. And the Gemara's kasha here, which is coming back to the dinim of Shvi'is, was clearly from the Amirayim that did not have the word Avanim in the Mishnah. They had the girsa of our Mishnah, Eitzim and Asavim. So they want to know, Gemara Af Avanim came? Was it the same that Barishoina, if you had large and small stones, were you then allowed to remove the big ones by leaving the small ones? So the Gemara says, yeah. Ashkachtani af ba'avanim. They found some who had the girsa in the Mishnah, the way we have it, that the Mishnah explicitly said, af ba'avanim. That's all Barishoinim. Okay. Everything that we learned. Kevan, the whole Marasayin is only if my intent is because I want the wood, let's say, for firewood. If I want to clear the field, then you're not allowed to do it. There are many people that trick themselves. A person has to be honest with what is my real intent, not what would I want for my intent to be. Because And 10th aleph allows me to do it. Kavana beis, this allows me to do it. So I want to have kavana aleph. That's not emizdik. I can think the words in my head, but I cannot feel it in my heart. Because if what I really want is for the field not to be so messy, so when it comes on the 8th year, I should be able to plant quicker rather than having to work on the 8th year. If this is what I desire, if that's it's like a kavanas halev, then just thinking the words, no, I only want the woods for firewood, even though I might also want it for firewood. So the Gemara is going to emphasize the importance for a person to be honest with themselves. And we're going to use a play on words that akel, just the word akel, was literally when they would press olives, they would need to have a certain type of lattice work of wood which is called an akel, that they would press down on the olives. It was a certain keli that they would use. In the Holy Tongue, it's called an akel. And an akalak lakois, which means a crooked heart. So the Gemara is saying, Halev yoideya, that your heart knows, im la'ekel, im la'akalak kalois, whether you are doing it because indeed you're removing the woods, because you need to make this netting, you need to make this lattice work, you need to make a keli, you need firewood, if that's really what you need, your heart knows. Or your heart wants really to clear the field, but you're not allowed to do it, marasayin, or you're not allowed to do it, isur derabanan. So I found an excuse now. And who is going to determine that? Not your brain, but your heart. Halev yodeya. And indeed, the Gemara says the following story, that Rabbi Yosi b'shem Menachem, Rabbi Akiva avad kishitosei. Rabbi Akiva did his duty. The Rash Ilyo, 2 lines in the bottom of the right column, explains that the Rabbi Akiva would, I'm reading inside, Hoya, the last line, Oiver b'shnas hashmita. Rabbi Akiva would go on the Shemitah year. He would go through the fields, and he would go through the vineyards, lirois, to inspect, im yesh oivrei aveda, if people are violating the laws of preparing the fields, and he would do that limchais biyadim, to protest. Why was Rabbi Akiva the one doing it? Because the nasi hoya, umutal olav, that was his responsibility. He was the leader. The chein hoya ragel, the words keshitasi means he did what he regularly did. And chama, and he saw that chad izmar kanamo, he saw someone pruning a vineyard. Amalein, he told him, V'lei sasid, is it not forbidden? Now guys, pruning isn't only an isur derabanan, right? From the avos, one of the 4 avos is karma chaloi sizmoir. We're going to have a problem with that. We'll see. But let's first read the Gemara. He saw someone pruning, and he told him, is this not prohibited? Armalei, so the yid, the person, the pruner, the farmer, told Rabbi Akiva that la'aklin anoboya. La'aklin is like we said. He needed some sort of netting, some sort of keli, to press down his pile of olives. He needed that. For that, he needed wood. So he told him, I am not pruning the tree to better the tree. I'm pruning the tree. I need the wood. Amalei, so Rabbi Akiva told him that was the expression. Halev yodeya im leikol im la'akul koiles. Your heart knows whether you need the equal or whether you're being crooked. Again, the vart is that there's no debate. This guy was going to use the wood. He was going to use it for a netting. He was going to use it for an instrument that he needed for his olive press. But you know, we trick ourselves. We fool ourselves. And who is going to determine my honesty? Not my mind. My mind will rationalize. My heart will know. Now, Rabbi Akiva was implying that if indeed this person needed wood for his akel, he would be allowed to prune. The problem is, how would you be allowed to do that? You see, pruning is not clearing a field. Clearing a field is an isur derabanan. And we already spoke about the psikresha part, right? Psikresha, you're pruning a field. How can you clear the field? Psikresha. So we already spoke of Tosfos and Moed Katan. First of all, there is a question whether we say psikresha even by an isur derabanan. Number 2, you're doing it with a shinui. But none of that applies by an isur doiraisa. That's the problem. So there's a Tosfos in Sanhedrin that actually addresses this Gemara over here in Bavli. And Tosfos says, obviously, that it must be that this person was pruning his tree in a way that it did not benefit the tree. And by the way, when we went to the vineyard, that's what we witnessed a couple of whenever it was, that we saw pruning, and from where do you prune? What knot do you have to cut off? And if you don't prune it properly, you're not doing any benefit. It must be that way. Still, you're not allowed to prune. That's an isur derabanan. That is addressed with the fact that if Itaka did it le'ikul, he would be allowed to do it. The takeaway from this Gemara is very good. Is that Halev Yodea? I think that's the Iker Chiddush over here. That the mind is tricky. Your mind can trick you. You can convince yourself of something that's not truthful. Who's gonna be the arbiter? The heart. Okay.
Isn't that the answer to all the questions we've been studying?
Which
That
is
the heart knows everything, clearing the field, not picking up large, small stones. You can say that for everything.
very good. That's why the Gemara is concluding with this. The Gemara is concluding with everything that all of these people, they rationalized because they would use the stone, they would use the wood, they would use it. But Rabbi Akiva says your heart knows the emes. In other words, without looking inside your heart, you might trick yourself. It gets tricky. Okay. Now this Mishnah, guys, we're moving on to halacha base. And like we spoke out in the words of introduction, that the various parts to the Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah is a knas that the Chazal were not consistent with. Sometimes they would penalize, sometimes they wouldn't penalize, and the Mishnah will determine when do we penalize someone who violated Shvi'is, and when will we not penalize someone who violates Shvi'is? So says the Mishnah, if a field was cleared out from thorns, even though you were not allowed to do that, we're not speaking about maras ayin, but your kavanah was to clear your field, so you violated. However, let's use these words, clearing out your field from thorns is not considered a significant act. Why is that? Because it doesn't stimulate growth. It's not like plowing. It's not like fertilizing. Yeah, I get it. You removed things that were getting in your way. You shouldn't have done it. But the land is still horrible. You have to do all of these next steps. You have to do other things prior to planting. So that's called a non-significant act. You were not allowed to do it, but there's no penalty. What does it mean there was no penalty? That tizara l'matzoy shvis. That you can right away plant your field matzoy shvis. That's only if your violation was a non-significant action. But if you improved your field, the definition of improving a field is you plowed your field. Plowing the field is a significant act because now the field is ready for planting. Or that's shenidaita that we had in the previous chapter. Or if you fertilized your field, fertilizing the field also, it's called a significant act. Now, even though you didn't do it directly, but you did it by penning in an area with the kavana for your field to be fertilized. Or if you did not limit yourself, remember, to the 2 beisa that can then be doubled or can be quadrupled, but not more. You penned the entire field on Shvi'is, so not only did you violate, but now it's called you made a significant act. Now there's a knas. You may not plant the field matzoy shvis. Now here, I just want you to know that there's a big machlekes in the Rishonim. Some are very machmir. They understand the Mishnah to mean that you may not plant the field the entire 8th year. The entire 8th year is a big guzma. All right? Many other Rishonim say it doesn't mean that. But they compare it to what we have in Hilchas Shabbos, b'chdei sheyeh asur, remember that? So if a person, sometimes, let's say a person did bishul, when it's b'shoigeg, it's complicated over there. You have to machlekes 3, machlekes tanoim. You have to know how it works. But many times we say you can't benefit from it, but as long as you wait the time that it would have taken you to do it after Shabbos, so something like that you can't immediately plant the field on the 8th year, but at some point later in the 8th year, you can plant it, which either way, the Mishnah just points out that at times the Chazal penalized the one who violated Shvi'is, and the Chiddush here is that this does not refer to someone who violated an Isur Doiraisa. This is someone who violated an Isur Derabanan. Nevertheless, sometimes there's a knas. Next topic in the Mishnah. If you have a field, shenitaiva, all right, that let's say the field was plowed on Shvi'is, and that stimulated growth. And now produce grew on Shvi'is because of your plowing. In other words, you did an action that made the produce better. So we're not speaking about you and the field. Now we're speaking about the produce itself. That's this part of the Mishnah. Beishamai oimrim ein oichlin peidoiseo b'shvi'is. That, let me word it these ways. The knas isn't only on the violator, on the gavra, that there's an isur chefza. In other words, the product that grew, since it grew through a shvi'is violation, is a product that's prohibited for everyone. No one can eat those fruits. Guys, don't confuse this with svichim. Like I mentioned, svichim is something that grows on its own. Nothing was violated, and midrabanan, you're not allowed to eat it. Svichim is not on everything. Svichim is not on fruits, for example. There's no svichim. Here we're saying that even the fruits, no, it's that which would have been permitted since someone violated shvius, and that product became better. Beishamai says the product itself, midrabanan, becomes prohibited.
Could you make it hefker to goyim?
What was that?
Could you make it hefker to the goyim?
In other words, it becomes hefker. When you have a product that Chazal say you can benefit from, just as a rule, anything that's asur becomes. One second, I'm going to take that back, Kevin, because the Mishnah says you can't eat. You can't eat means you can't eat. I don't think it means you can't have benefit.
Oh,
hefker is only something that is asur bano, right? If I make a neder that it's asur bano, then it becomes hefker. Here it's not asur bano. I can't eat it. However, Beisil Aloimnim, no oichlin. You oichlin. Look inside the top of Rashirilio. I think we'll stop over here. Beisil Aloimnim oichlin. In other words, the violator is going to be penalized. Make no mistake. The person who did that plowing, he cannot benefit from his isur. But the item itself, the item cannot become why? Because the kivin, the soda b'shvis hefker. This is the logic. How can you create an ifsar hefzer if ein adam oiser davar that's not his? Ein adam oiser davar she'ena shaloi. That's gavaldik. I'm skipping the brackets in the Rashirilio. Third line. V'laf kol kiminei. He doesn't have the capacity lahafkia koyach ha'aniyim to take away the koyach ha'aniyim or and the koyach kol alma. However, in other words, Beisila says you can eat. Says that Rashirilio, like I just mentioned, others can eat. The chi shari Beisila. Beisila's leniency is gabaperos aveda hainu la'achedim avol l'rasha ha'over shita da'asirei, and he brings proof some other areas in halachah. So in other words, gavaldik. Beishamai says you create an ifsar chefzer. Beisilal says there's an isa gavra on the violator, and the logic behind Beisilal is because of the rule ein adam oiser davar she'ena shaloi. Beautiful, guys. We'll stop over here to be continued.
Yeah,